A teenage girl is supposed to have time to finish school, to figure out who she is, to make the kind of mistakes that do not cost everything. The cases in this video are about what happens when that time runs out too early, and about the people responsible who were never made to answer for it. Some of these girls were killers themselves, children who made decisions that the law could not fully account for, who walked free on the day of the verdict, or served a few years and disappeared into lives that continue somewhere today. Some were victims, taken from parking lots and country lanes and nightclub bar stools by people whose names never made it onto a charge sheet. What connects every case here is simple. Someone got away with it. The girl who walked out of court at 13, the man who drove away from an empty parking lot with a child in his cab and was never found. Today we are covering 10 unsolved murders of teenage girls. Case 1. Mary Bell and Norma Bell. 4-year-old Martin Brown was found on the afternoon of May 25, 1968, inside an abandoned house on Cross Hill Road in Scotswood, a working-class neighbourhood on the western edge of Newcastle upon Tyne. He was lying on the floor. There was saliva on his cheek and a small amount of blood near his mouth. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anything. The house was derelict, one of several in that part of Scotswood that children used as play spaces because the streets offered nothing else. Police arrived and looked at the boy and at the building and at the lack of any obvious injury, and they recorded his death as accidental. The assumption was that he had swallowed pills left behind in the empty property. His mother, June Brown, was told her son was gone. The neighbourhood grieved for a few days and then tried to move forward. Martin had been born in 1966. He was small and quiet and had been seen playing near Cross Hill Road on the afternoon he died. He was 2 years old when he took his first steps, and 4 years old when he took his last ones. And the gap between those two facts is so small that it takes a moment to sit with it. 2 days after Martin was found, someone broke into a nursery school nearby. Furniture was overturned. Notes were written on a blackboard, in the kind of handwriting that belonged to a child. One of the notes appeared to confess to something. Police treated the break-in as a prank and did not connect it to the death on Cross Hill Road. The notes were photographed and filed and largely forgotten. 2 months passed. On July 31, 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe was reported missing by his family. He had been playing outside on St. Margaret's Road that afternoon. Children went looking for him as evening came in, and they found him on a nearby patch of wasteland. Brian had been strangled. There were marks on his skin, consistent with small hands gripping his throat. His thighs showed puncture wounds. A pair of scissors had been left near the body, and there was a faint carving on his abdomen in the shape of the letter M. This time, nobody called it an accident. Detective Chief Superintendent James Dobson led the investigation. The neighbourhood was canvassed door to door. Statements were taken from every child who could be located. Parents were interviewed. The wasteland and the surrounding streets were searched. In the course of those interviews, 2 girls began to surface in multiple accounts. One was Mary Flora Bell, who had turned 11 years old the day after Martin Brown was found dead. She lived on White House Road. The other was Norma Joyce Bell, who was 13 and lived next door to Mary. They shared a surname but were not related. Mary had been born on May 26, 1957, to a 16-year-old girl named Betty McCricket. Accounts gathered years later by the journalist Gitta Sereny described a home life that had been disordered from the first moments of Mary's life. Betty had reportedly told hospital staff to remove the baby from her sight immediately after delivery. She later married a man named Billy Bell, whose surname Mary carried, though who Mary's biological father was remained a matter of dispute. Betty Bell was later said to have worked as a sex worker and to have subjected Mary to abuse, including sexual abuse, from a very young age. Psychiatrists who later examined Mary concluded that her emotional development had been severely damaged in her earliest years, before she was old enough to understand what was being done to her. By the time Mary was 10, neighbours in Scotswood had already noticed things about her. She had been seen attacking other children. She had reportedly tried to strangle several younger kids on separate occasions before Martin Brown died, incidents that were treated at the time as rough play. She had a quality that adults around her found difficult to name. She was articulate and watchful and capable of saying the right thing at exactly the right moment, which is not a quality most people associate with a child. Norma Bell's life was quieter. She was 2 years older than Mary, but described by people who knew her as slow, gentle, and easily led. She and Mary had become close in the way children who live next door to each other become close, through proximity and habit rather than deep affinity. What Norma understood about what she was involved in, and how much of it she chose, was something the courts would later spend considerable time trying to determine. During the investigation, Mary's behavior set her apart from every other child who was interviewed. She was composed in a way that struck the detectives as wrong. She volunteered specific details about the locations of the bodies, details that had not been made public. She showed an active curiosity about the physical condition of the victims. After Brian Howe's death, she went to his family's door and told his mother she knew Brian was dead and asked whether she could see him in his coffin. The request was noted by the officer accompanying the family liaison visits. Handwriting analysis connected the notes left at the nursery school after Martin Brown's death to both Mary and Norma. The forensic examination of Brian Howe's body confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation and established that the carving had been made post-mortem using the scissors found at the scene. The grip pattern was consistent with small hands. The totality of the behavioral evidence and the physical evidence was enough to arrest both girls in August 1968. Their trial opened at the Newcastle Assizes on December 5, 1968. It lasted 9 days. Both girls were charged with 2 counts of murder. The courtroom was arranged with some consideration for the age of the defendants, with lawyers permitted to sit alongside their clients to reduce the formality of the proceedings. The press was present throughout and grew in number as the trial progressed. The contrast between the 2 girls was visible from the first day. Mary sat attentively and engaged with the proceedings in a manner that several observers described as almost clinical. She made remarks from the dock that were sharp enough to draw comment from the barristers. She was later said to have described the entire trial as a blur, but in the courtroom she appeared to be absorbing everything. Norma, by contrast, was visibly overwhelmed. She was described in press reports as a pathetic child who could not follow what was happening around her. The prosecution argued that whoever killed Brian Howe had also killed Martin Brown, and that Mary had been the driving force in both cases. The court heard from handwriting experts about the nursery notes. It heard about Mary's visits to the families of the dead boys, her requests to view the bodies, and her detailed knowledge of the crime scenes. It heard psychiatric evidence describing Mary as displaying the classic traits of a psychopathic personality disorder, a child who lacked the capacity for empathy and who had shown a demonstrated interest in causing suffering to others. Dr. Robert Orton testified that Mary suffered from a psychopathic personality disorder, that she had demonstrated a consistent lack of feeling toward others, and that she was liable to act on impulse without regard for consequences. The prosecution told the court that the 2 murders had been committed solely for the pleasure and excitement of killing. Norma gave evidence that positioned her as a reluctant presence. She admitted being there. She admitted helping to bring the children to the locations where they died. She described Mary as the one who had done what was done. She said she had not known how to stop it and had not known how to tell anyone afterward. The jury of 5 women and 7 men deliberated for under 4 hours. On December 17, 1968, they returned to Court 2 at Newcastle Assizes with their verdicts. Norma Bell was acquitted of all charges. The jury accepted that she was a passive, slow-witted girl who had been drawn into events by a younger and more calculating companion. She walked out of the building that afternoon and went home to Scotswood. She was 13 years old. What became of Norma Bell after that day has never been part of any public record. Mary Bell was found not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, a verdict that acknowledged the killings while recognizing that her mental functioning had been substantially impaired. Mr. Justice Cusack described her as a very grave risk to other children and sentenced her to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, an indeterminate term with no fixed release date. Mary served 12 years across several institutions, beginning at the Red Bank Secure Unit in Lancashire. In 1977, she briefly escaped from the open prison to which she had been transferred, was found hitchhiking in Cheshire with another inmate, and was returned to custody without incident. In 1980, at the age of 23, she was released on license. She was given a new name and a new location, and a court order protecting her identity. She settled into a community somewhere in England, found work, and attempted to build a life. In 1984, she gave birth to a daughter. Her daughter grew up not knowing who her mother was. In 1998, when the journalist Gitta Sereni published a biography of the case, and Mary received a fee for her participation, newspapers traced her location and published details that exposed both Mary and her daughter. They were forced to move. Mary went to the High Court, and in 2003 was granted lifelong anonymity for herself and her daughter. The legal protection put in place for her became known in British law as a Mary Bell Order, a term now applied to any court ruling that permanently protects the identity of a convicted person in the United Kingdom. Mary Bell is 69 years old. She has lived freely in Britain for more than 45 years, under a name no one outside a small circle of officials has ever been permitted to print. She has a daughter and is said to have a grandchild. June Brown, the mother of Martin Brown, once told reporters that the protection extended to Bell felt like the wrong way around. Her son had no protection. He was 4 years old and he was gone. And the girl who strangled him was somewhere living a life he never got. Norma Bell walked out of Newcastle Assizes on December 17, 1968, and has never appeared in a court proceeding since. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 boys strangled in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. 1 girl served 12 years. The other walked out of court at 13 and was never seen in a courtroom again. Next, a 12-year-old girl in a quiet Canadian suburb helped plan the killing of her own parents and 8-year-old brother, and the law gave her the same thing it gave Norma Bell. Case 2. Jasmine Richardson. On the morning of April 24, 2006, a boy walked past a house on a quiet residential street in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and thought he saw something through the basement window that did not look right. He went home and told his mother. His mother called the police. Inspector Brent Secondiak arrived at the property, looked through the same window the boy had described, and saw at least one person lying on the floor below. Officers entered the house and found Mark Richardson, 42 years old, and his wife Deborah, 48, in the basement. Both had been stabbed multiple times. Mark had been stabbed 24 times. Deborah had been stabbed 12 times, including one wound 12 centimeters deep that had pierced her heart. Upstairs, in his bedroom among his toys, was 8-year-old Tyler Jacob Richardson. His jugular vein had been severed. He had additional stab wounds to his chest and face. The family's 12-year-old daughter, Jasmine, was not in the house. Police initially considered that she might be a victim too, taken or harmed somewhere outside the home. That assumption did not last long. Medicine Hat sits in the southeastern corner of Alberta, a city of around 60,000 people built where the South Saskatchewan River bends through the prairie. It is the kind of place where violent crime is not common, and where a triple homicide inside a family home is the sort of event that reshapes how an entire community understands itself. In April 2006, the streets were quiet, and the weather was beginning to turn towards spring, and none of the Richardson family's neighbors had heard anything from inside that house that would have told them what was happening. Mark and Deborah Richardson had raised their children in a household described by people who knew them as warm and ordinary. Mark worked, and Deborah was involved in her children's lives. They had been recovering from earlier difficulties, including a period of substance abuse in their past, and by 2006, they had built something stable. Jasmine had been, by most accounts, a good student and a social girl before the autumn of 2005. She had friends, she attended school, and she had not given her parents serious cause for alarm until she met Jeremy Steinke. Steinke was 23 years old. He had met Jasmine at a punk rock concert, reportedly without knowing her exact age, though he knew she was very young. He described himself online and in conversation as a 300-year-old werewolf. He was deeply embedded in the Gothic subculture and spent significant time on a website called vampirefreaks.com, where he and Jasmine communicated after their initial meeting. Jasmine was drawn to him immediately. She changed her appearance, her clothing, and the way she presented herself online within weeks of meeting him. Her parents noticed and were alarmed. When Mark and Deborah Richardson found out about the relationship between their 12-year-old daughter and a 23-year-old man, they did what parents in their position would do. They grounded Jasmine. They forbade contact. They tried to pull her back from something they could see was dangerous. For Jasmine and Jeremy, this response became, in their shared thinking, a justification for what came next. In the months before April 2006, Jasmine told friends more than once that she was planning to have her parents killed. She said it with enough regularity that it was heard by multiple people. None of them believed her. Some thought she was performing the kind of dark talk that teenagers in that subculture used for effect. Some found it unsettling but did not know what to do with the information. The plan was real. The night before the killings, Jasmine and Jeremy watched the 1994 film Natural Born Killers together. On the evening of April 23, 2006, Jeremy Steinke arrived at the Richardson family home. He entered wearing a neoprene mask and carrying a knife. He went to the basement, where he encountered Deborah Richardson and stabbed her to death. Mark Richardson heard his wife and came running. Mark fought back with a screwdriver. Steinke stabbed him 24 times. Jasmine, by her own later account, went to her brother Tyler's bedroom. Tyler was 8 years old. He was killed in his room. The two of them left the house and drove away. Casey Lancaster, a 19-year-old friend of Steinke's, drove them in her pickup truck and later helped dispose of evidence. The following morning, the neighbor's child looked through the window and saw what the family inside could no longer tell anyone about. Jasmine and Jeremy were located and arrested by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police on April 25, 2006, in Leader, Saskatchewan, 2 days after the killings. They had not traveled far. Jasmine showed no distress at the time of arrest that investigators found consistent with a traumatized child. Steinke later confessed to an undercover police officer in detail. The investigation confirmed the physical evidence against both of them. Online messages between Jasmine and Jeremy discussing the plan were recovered. Testimony from the friends she had told about her intentions was gathered. The case against both was substantial. The trials proceeded separately. Jeremy Steinke was tried as an adult. In December 2008, he was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences, with parole eligibility after 25 years. He later changed his name to Jackson May. Jasmine Richardson was tried as a youth. Under the Youth Criminal Justice Act of Canada, any person who was under 14 years of age at the time of their offence cannot be tried as an adult and cannot receive a sentence of more than 10 years, regardless of the number or severity of the crimes. Jasmine had been 12 when the killings took place. The maximum the law could give her was 10 years. Her trial ran through June and July of 2007. She pleaded not guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. On July 9, 2007, they returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts. Jasmine Richardson became the youngest person in Canadian history to be convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder. She was 13 years old when the verdict was read. On November 8, 2007, she was sentenced to 10 years under the Intensive Rehabilitative Custody and Supervision Program, the maximum available under the law. The sentence included credit for 18 months already served, 4 years in a psychiatric facility, and 4.5 years of conditional supervision in the community. In September 2011, while still technically serving her sentence under community supervision, she enrolled as a first-year student at Mount Royal University in Calgary. On May 6, 2016, Jasmine Richardson's sentence was officially complete. She appeared at a final court hearing, was released from all conditions and supervision, and offered no apology or statement of remorse. A publication ban under Canadian law meant her name could not be printed in her home country. She was known publicly only as JR. Officials described her rehabilitation as successful. She was 22 years old. She walked out of that hearing and into a life lived under a new identity at an undisclosed location somewhere in Canada. Mark Richardson was 42. Deborah Richardson was 48. Tyler Jacob Richardson was 8 years old. He had toys in his room and a jugular vein that a 12-year-old severed in the dark while her boyfriend was killing their parents downstairs. The Canadian legal system did what it was designed to do. It applied the law as written. Jasmine was a child when she committed the crime, and the law had a ceiling built in for children, and that ceiling was 10 years. Whether 10 years is the right answer for 3 people stabbed to death in their own home is a question the law does not ask. The law only answers what it is built to answer. For the Richardson family, the answer the law gave was a 22-year-old woman with a new name walking out of a courthouse in 2016 with nothing further required of her. She is 32 years old today. Where she lives, what name she uses, and what her life looks like are not known to anyone outside a narrow circle. The only things that are on the record are the ones that cannot be taken back. 3 members of one family, one night in Medicine Hat. A sentence that ended 10 years later with a door opening and a woman walking through it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A 12-year-old planned the killing of her own family and walked free at 22 with a new name and no further conditions. Next, 4 teenage girls in Indiana took turns torturing a 12-year-old child through the night and into the early hours of the morning, and 2 of them are living freely in the community today. Case 3. The murder of Shanda Sharer. On the night of January 10, 1992, 2 teenage girls knocked on the front door of a house in Jeffersonville, Indiana. They told the 12-year-old girl who answered that they were there to take her to see Amanda Hevrin. Amanda was a girl Shanda had been close to at school, a girl she had written notes to and spent time with in the way that 12-year-olds do when something feels important and new. The 2 girls at the door were Toni Lawrence and Hope Rippey, both 15 years old. Shanda Sharer had never met them before. She had no reason to be suspicious. She got in the car. Shanda Renee Sharer had been born on June 6, 1979, in Pineville, Kentucky. After her parents divorced, her mother remarried, and the family relocated to Louisville, and then later to New Albany, Indiana, in the autumn of 1991. She was 12 years old when she started at her new school, a small and social girl who made friends without much difficulty. One of those friends was Amanda Hevrin, who was older and who Shanda had grown close to quickly. What Shanda did not know when she walked into that school was that Amanda Hevrin was also involved with a 16-year-old girl named Melinda Lovelace, and that Melinda Lovelace had a way of thinking about the people around her that was going to become Shanda's problem in ways she could not have anticipated. Melinda Lovelace had grown up in a household marked by documented abuse and instability. By 16, she had a history of violent behavior and a possessiveness around Amanda Hevrin that was known to people in her circle. When she found out that Amanda was spending time with Shanda, she began sending the 12-year-old death threats. She made her intentions clear to friends and acquaintances on more than one occasion. Shanda's parents became aware enough of the situation that they transferred her to a Catholic school to put some distance between their daughter and the threat. The distance did not hold. Lori Tackett was 17 years old and lived in Madison, Indiana, about an hour from New Albany. She was a friend of Melinda's and had her own history of instability. On the evening of January 10, 1992, Melinda called Lori and told her what she wanted to do. Lori drove to New Albany with Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence in the car. They picked up Melinda, then they drove to Shanda's father's house and knocked on the door. Shanda came outside. She got into the car under the impression she was going to see Amanda. Within a short time, she understood she was not. What followed lasted approximately 8 hours. The 4 girls drove Shanda to an abandoned building where Melinda confronted her. Shanda was beaten and threatened with a knife. She was placed in the trunk of the car. They drove to Lori Tackett's house in Madison, where the violence continued through the night. Shanda was beaten repeatedly. She was stabbed. She was strangled with a rope. She lost consciousness multiple times. At various points through the night, witnesses later said, she regained consciousness and called out. The 4 girls made decisions about what to do with her and kept doing what they were doing. In the early hours of January 11th, they drove to a rural field in Jefferson County. Shanda was still alive when they poured gasoline on her. They lit a fire. She died from the burns and smoke inhalation. A hunter found her remains later that morning in the field. She had ligature marks on her neck, lacerations across her body, and burns covering the portions of her that remained. Police moved quickly once they had the first statement. Toni Lawrence, the youngest and the least directly involved in the violence, was the first to talk. She gave investigators an account of the night that named all 4 participants and described the sequence of events in detail. The other 3 were located and taken into custody within hours. All 4 were charged as adults. Shanda's case was covered nationally. The combination of the victim's age, the number of perpetrators, the length of the ordeal, and the fact that all 4 were teenage girls made it the kind of case that news programs and talk shows returned to repeatedly in the years that followed. The question that came up most often was the one that the facts made unavoidable. How had 4 girls between the ages of 15 and 17 spent 8 hours torturing a child without any of them stopping it? All 4 pleaded guilty. They did not go to trial. Tony Lawrence, who had remained in the car for portions of the night and whose level of direct participation investigators assessed as the lowest of the 4, was convicted of criminal confinement. She was sentenced to 20 years. She was released on December 14, 2000, after approximately 9 years. She was 23 years old when she walked out. Hope Rippey was convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson. She was sentenced to 40 years, later reduced to 35. A judge cut additional time for good behavior, and she was released on April 28, 2006, after serving approximately 14 years. She was 29 years old. She left the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis and moved into a life that has remained largely private since. Lori Tackett was convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson, and sentenced to 60 years. She was released on parole on January 11, 2018, the anniversary of Shanda's death, after 25 years. She was released with conditions that included treatment requirements and restrictions around children. Melinda Loveless, who had organized the night and whose jealousy over Amanda Heverin had set everything in motion, was also convicted of murder, criminal confinement, and arson, and sentenced to 60 years. She served 23 years and 8 months before being released from the Indiana Women's Prison in September 2019. She was 43 years old. She was placed on parole and relocated to Kentucky. All 4 women are free today. The mathematics of what each of them served relative to what was done to Shanda Sharer across those 8 hours is something Shanda's family has spoken about in interviews over the years. Her mother and her father attended hearings and gave statements, and watched each of the 4 women leave through the same door they had entered as teenagers. Shanda's mother said in one interview that she could not understand how a sentence could end when the thing that caused it had no ending for the people who loved the girl in the field. Shanda Sharer would have been 46 years old this year. She was 12 when she got into a car with 2 strangers who told her she was going to see someone she cared about. The last hours of her life were spent in a field in Jefferson County in January cold, and the 4 girls who put her there have been living in the community for years. Melinda Loveless had sent Shanda Sharer death threats before she ever met her in person. She was not subtle about what she intended. The people who heard her talk about it thought she was performing. She was not performing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 teenage girls tortured a 12-year-old child through the night and were all free before they turned 50. Next, 2 girls in Wisconsin stabbed their classmate 19 times in the woods to please a fictional character they had found on the internet, and one of them was released into the community before she turned 20. Case 4. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier. On the morning of May 31, 2014, a bicyclist riding through a wooded area near a park in Waukesha, Wisconsin, found a 12-year-old girl lying on the ground. She had been stabbed 19 times. One of the wounds had missed her heart by less than a millimeter. She was conscious enough to speak. She told the bicyclist she needed help. He called for an ambulance and stayed with her until it arrived. Her name was Peyton Leutner. She was in the 6th grade. The night before, she had attended a sleepover at the home of a classmate named Morgan Geyser. Another classmate, Anissa Weier, had also been there. All 3 girls were 12 years old. In the morning, Morgan and Anissa had suggested going to a nearby park. Peyton had agreed. When they reached a wooded section of the park, Morgan produced a kitchen knife and stabbed Peyton repeatedly, while Anissa stood beside her and cheered her on. When Peyton stopped moving, the 2 girls walked away and left her where she had fallen. They told investigators later that they had believed she needed to die in order for Slenderman to accept them as his servants and protect their families from harm. Slenderman is a fictional character. He was created in 2009 by a user named Eric Knudsen as part of an online horror writing contest. The original image showed a tall, faceless figure in a dark suit standing among trees in the background of an otherwise ordinary photograph. The image spread across the internet and grew into an elaborate mythology built from user contributions, forum posts, and amateur videos. None of it was real. Slender Man does not exist. Morgan and Anissa had spent months reading about him online and had come to believe, together, that he was a real entity who required proof of loyalty. Morgan Geyser had been born and raised in Waukesha. Her father had a documented history of mental illness, which would become relevant later. In the period leading up to May 2014, Morgan had begun to show signs of a break from reality that had not been recognized or treated. She later described conversations with Slender Man and other fictional characters as experiences she had taken to be genuine. She had kept these experiences private and had found in Anissa a person who appeared to share her belief system. Anissa Wire had also spent time immersed in the Slender Man mythology online. Whether her belief was as complete as Morgan's, or whether she had convinced herself through the course of their shared obsession, was something that psychiatrists and the court would later examine. What was documented was that both girls had planned the attack for several months, had agreed on its purpose, and had carried it out together on the morning of May 31 at a park in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Peyton Leutner survived because she refused to stop moving. After Morgan and Anissa left her in the woods, she crawled through the undergrowth toward the road. She was in and out of consciousness. She kept going because, as she later said, she wanted to live. The bicyclist found her on the edge of the tree line. She was airlifted to a hospital and underwent surgery. She was discharged and has spoken publicly about the attack and its aftermath in the years since. She described in one interview learning that two of her friends had planned to kill her and then discovering that they believed they had done it for a fictional creature they had read about on the internet. She said the thing that stayed with her most was not the wounds but the planning. They had been planning it for months. Morgan and Anissa were arrested the same day, walking along a road several miles from the park. When investigators asked them why they had done it, both gave detailed accounts of the Slender Man mythology and their belief that the attack was required. Morgan said she had been receiving communications from Slender Man for some time. Anissa described their shared understanding that killing Peyton would elevate them to the status of his servants. Both girls were charged as adults with attempted first-degree intentional homicide. The legal proceedings moved slowly because of the psychiatric complexity of the cases. Morgan was diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia. The diagnosis was significant and not disputed. Her lawyers argued that she had genuinely not been able to distinguish between the fictional world she had absorbed and the real one she was living in. Anissa's mental state was assessed separately and found to also meet the threshold for a mental disease defense, though her diagnosis was different. In 2017, both girls pleaded guilty. The guilty pleas were entered as part of arrangements under which both were found not guilty by reason of mental disease. The outcome meant neither would serve time in a conventional prison. Both were committed to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, for treatment. Anissa Wire was sentenced in December 2017 to a maximum of 25 years of institutional commitment. Before sentencing, she told the court she deeply regretted what had happened and held herself accountable. The sentence was structured retroactively to the date of the crime, meaning her commitment would run until she was 37 years old. Morgan Geyser was sentenced in February 2018 to a maximum of 40 years of institutional commitment. Anissa Wire was the first to petition for release. In July 2021, after serving approximately 4 years at Winnebago, a judge granted her conditional release. She was 19 years old. The conditions of her release included living with her father and wearing a GPS monitor. Her commitment supervision would continue until she turned 37, but she was no longer inside the facility. Morgan Geyser's path was slower. She filed petitions for release in 2022 and 2023, and withdrew them both before they were heard. In January 2025, she appeared before Waukesha County Circuit Judge Michael Boren, who heard from 3 medical experts who had been working closely with her. All 3 concluded she was no longer a threat to the public. The judge acknowledged that what she had done in 2014 had been a brutal, terrible offense. He granted her conditional release. She was 22 years old. Prosecutors had attempted to block the release. They argued that Morgan had been quietly reading material involving graphic violence during her time at Winnebago and had been communicating with a man who collected memorabilia associated with murderers. The judge weighed those concerns against the medical testimony and approved the release plan. Morgan was placed in a supervised group home in Madison, Wisconsin, in the summer of 2025. On the night of November 22, 2025, staff at the group home noticed that Morgan Geyser's GPS monitor was generating tamper alerts. At approximately 11:30 that night, they called the home to check on her. Staff at the residence went to look and found her bedroom door locked. They found the ankle monitoring device on her bed with a pair of scissors nearby. Geyser had cut off the monitor, climbed out of her bedroom window, and left. The home reported her missing to police in the early hours of November 23. Officers began searching. About 24 hours after she had last been seen, Geyser was located at a truck stop in Posen, Illinois, approximately 170 miles south of Madison, with a 43-year-old companion named Chad Mecca. She was arrested without incident and signed a waiver of extradition. She was brought back to Wisconsin and held in the Waukesha County Jail. Her attorney argued she should be returned to a mental health facility rather than remain in jail, on the basis that she had no new criminal charges and had previously been found not guilty by reason of mental disease. In December 2025, Waukesha County Circuit Judge K. Scott Wagner approved the Department of Health Services' request to revoke her conditional release. She was returned to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. 3 corrections staff members faced disciplinary action in connection with the escape. 1 was terminated. Anissa Wire remains on conditional release in the community as of the time of writing. Morgan Geyser is back inside Winnebago, pending further proceedings. The question of when and whether she will be released again is one the courts have not yet finished answering. Peyton Leutner, who crawled out of the woods in Waukesha, Wisconsin, in May 2014 because she wanted to live, is 23 years old. She graduated high school. She has spoken about what happened to her. She said she does not spend much time thinking about the 2 girls who left her in the trees. She said she thinks more about the bicyclist who stopped. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 12-year-olds stabbed a classmate 19 times for a fictional character they found on the internet, and both have spent time living in the community since. Next, the video shifts away from the girls who did the killing and toward the girls who were taken. The first of those cases goes back to 1956, to 2 sisters who left home for an Elvis film on a December night in Chicago and were never seen alive again. Case 5. Barbara and Patricia Grimes, December in Chicago in 1956, was the kind of cold that settled into a neighborhood and stayed. The streets in McKinley Park were quiet after dark, and the families who lived there kept their routines close to home. Joseph Grimes drove a truck for a living. His wife Loretta worked as a company clerk for Park Davis. They had raised several children in a neighborhood of working-class Catholics who kept their heads down and their children close. The Grimes household was not wealthy, but it was stable, and the 2 middle daughters, Barbara and Patricia, were by every account good girls, well-liked at school, and devoted to each other in the way sisters who are only 2 years apart sometimes are. Barbara Jean Grimes had been born on May 5, 1941. She was 15 years old in December 1956, a student at Thomas Kelly High School on the South Side. Patricia Kathleen Grimes had been born on December 31, 1943, which meant she would turn 13 in 3 days. She attended St. Maurice Catholic Elementary School. Both girls were, by the measure of their teachers and neighbors, exceptional students. Both girls were also, by the measure of teenage girls across the country in 1956, completely devoted to Elvis Presley. They had joined the official Elvis Presley fan club. They owned his records. They had seen his first film, Love Me Tender, at the Brighton Theatre on South Archer Avenue, not once, not twice, but 10 times since it opened. On the evening of December 28, 1956, they asked their mother if they could go again. Loretta said yes. She told them to be home by midnight. They left the house at 7:30 in the evening, walking or taking the bus the 1.5 miles to the Brighton Theatre. carrying around $2.50 between them. Barbara had been given an extra 50 cents with instructions to keep it in her wallet in case they wanted to stay for the second showing. A friend of Patricia's named Dorothy Weinert was at the Brighton Theatre that same evening with her own sister. Dorothy later told investigators that she and her sister had been seated directly behind Barbara and Patricia during the film and had spoken with them before it started. When Dorothy and her sister left at approximately 9:30 that night, the Grimes girls were still in their seats and had gotten up to join the concession line during the intermission between the two showings. Dorothy Weinert's account was the last reliably confirmed sighting of Barbara and Patricia Grimes while they were alive. Midnight came. Loretta waited. The clock moved past 12 and the house was quiet, and there was still no knock at the door. She sent her older daughter Teresa, who was 17, and her son Joey, who was 14, to wait at the bus stop near the house for their sisters. They came back without them. By morning, Loretta had gone to the police. The Chicago Police Department's initial response was the kind that families in this situation have experienced for as long as police departments have existed. Officers looked at two teenage girls who had not come home and concluded they had probably run away. It was Christmas break. There were boys. There were reasons young girls left. The case was logged and not actively pursued for several days. Joseph Grimes told the Chicago Daily Tribune on January 23, 1957, that he had tried to tell police his daughters had not run away from home, that they would not have done that their mother knew them and was telling the truth. The police had not listened. Those early days, when the trail from the theatre to wherever the girls went next was still fresh, passed without a serious canvass of the area, without a serious effort to trace the bus routes, without the kind of immediate investigative pressure that might have mattered. When investigators finally began treating the case with the urgency it deserved, everything accelerated. The disappearance became front-page news across Chicago within days and then spread nationally. The Chicago Police Department put over 100 officers onto the case at its peak. Tips flooded in from across Illinois and neighboring states, from people who said they had seen two girls matching the sisters' descriptions in hotels, diners, department stores, and bus stations throughout January. None of the sightings could be confirmed. Each one had to be checked. Each one came back empty. The case took on a dimension that almost no missing persons investigation in Chicago history had matched when Elvis Presley himself became aware of it. Presley went on national radio and addressed the sisters directly. He said that if Barbara and Patricia were listening, he wanted them to please go home to their mother. The appeal went everywhere. It was a measure of how large the story had grown that the singer, whose face had been on their bedroom walls, was now asking them through a microphone to come back. The working assumption at that stage was still that the girls had left voluntarily, that somewhere out there two teenage girls were hiding for reasons no one could identify and would eventually surface. They did not surface. Through December 30, through the first week of January 1957, through the second week, the tips kept coming, and none of them led anywhere definitive. A cab driver told investigators he had seen two girls matching Barbara and Patricia's descriptions on December 30th, sitting in a Skid Row diner on West Madison Street, with two men, one of whom had sideburns styled like Elvis Presley's. Police tracked down the diner and the route, and followed the lead as far as it went. It went nowhere provable. Investigators split into those who believed the girls were alive somewhere and those who were beginning to consider that they were not. Loretta Grimes continued to speak to the press throughout January. On January 11th, the Chicago Daily Tribune printed her appeal to whoever might be holding her daughters. If someone was keeping them, please let the girls call her. She was still using the word if. She had not allowed herself to stop hoping. On January 22, 1957, a man named Leonard Prescott was driving east on German Church Road near Willow Springs, Illinois, on the southwestern edge of the Chicago metropolitan area. He was passing a stretch of road bordered by a guardrail and a slope of open ground beyond it, when he noticed what appeared to be two department store mannequins lying in the frozen grass on the other side of the rail. Something made him slow down. He drove to his house, told his wife what he had seen, and drove back with her to look again. The two shapes on the ground were not mannequins, they were the bodies of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, lying unclothed in the cold, 25 days after they had walked out of the Brighton Theatre. Both girls were nude. Their clothing was never found. The bodies were taken to the Cook County morgue, to thaw before examination could begin. In their frozen state, several people who saw them noted visible trauma. Patricia had what appeared to be puncture wounds in her chest and abdomen, possible trauma to the left side of her face, and a possibly broken nose. Barbara had bruising on her face and head, and puncture wounds in her chest area. 3 experienced pathologists performed the autopsies over the course of 5 hours each. They could not agree on an exact time or location of death. Based on the contents of the girls' stomachs, the pathologists concluded they had died within approximately 4 to 5 hours of leaving the theatre on the evening of December 28. This placed the time of death in the late hours of December 28th, or the early hours of December 29. The official cause of death listed on both death certificates was secondary shock, resulting from exposure to low temperatures that had reduced their body temperatures below the critical level compatible with life. The bruising and puncture wounds found on both girls were attributed by the initial forensic team to post-mortem damage from rodents. The finding satisfied almost no one. Harry Gloss was the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office. He disagreed with both the official timeline and the official conclusions about the wounds. He told reporters publicly that Barbara had been sexually assaulted before her death, a detail police had been keeping quiet in order to filter the volume of incoming tips. He said the marks on the girls' bodies showed signs of ante-mortem violence, meaning violence that occurred before death, not after. He described Patricia's wounds as consistent with having been made by an ice pick rather than by animals. He described a thin layer of ice encrusted on the bodies that he believed meant the girls had been alive until at least January 7th, which would contradict the stomach contents timeline and suggest they had been held somewhere for days before being brought to the site on German Church Road. Coroner Walter McCarran held his own press conference the following day and fired Gloss. Gloss had disclosed confidential information, McCarran said, and that was the basis for the termination. Gloss continued to investigate the case independently for the rest of his life. The internal conflict between the two men and between their competing timelines left a permanent fault line through the official record of the case. Investigators who came later could not fully reconcile what the stomach contents suggested about time of death with what the condition of the bodies and the ice layer suggested about when they had last been alive. The investigation pivoted to suspects. The most prominent early figure was a man named Edward Benny Bedwell, a 21-year-old drifter from Tennessee who had moved to Chicago's Skid Row area and worked intermittently as a dishwasher in a restaurant on West Madison Street. He was tall, described as bearing a resemblance to Elvis Presley, and witnesses had placed him in the company of 2 young girls matching the sisters' descriptions at a diner in the area in late December or early January. Police brought Bedwell in for questioning in February 1957. They kept him in a motel for 3 days. By the end of those 3 days, Bedwell had signed a confession. In the confession, he described picking up the girls, spending time with them over the course of approximately a week, taking them to bars, feeding them hot dogs, and then doing something that resulted in their deaths after the girls refused to cooperate with him and an unnamed companion. Loretta Grimes went on the news immediately and called the confession a lie. She was right about the evidence. The autopsy toxicology had found no alcohol in either girl's system. No food consistent with what Bedwell described was present in either stomach. The timeline he described did not match the pathologist's findings. Key physical details in his account were wrong. The confession had been given by a man of limited intellectual capacity after 3 days of pressure in a motel room, and it did not hold up. Bedwell recanted. Police released him. No charges were ever filed. Bedwell was later tried in Florida for the rape of a 13-year-old girl committed in 1956 and was acquitted of that charge. He died in November 1972. The Bedwell episode damaged the investigation in ways that proved difficult to recover from. The public had largely decided he was guilty based on the initial reporting of the confession. When the charges evaporated, some people continued to believe he had done it. Others concluded the confession had been coerced and that the real perpetrator was still somewhere else. The police, having gone hard at one suspect and come away with nothing, had to begin again with a fractured internal consensus and a press that had been following every move. Additional suspects emerged in the years that followed. The most significant was Charles Leroy Melquist, a man from the Chicago suburbs who was convicted in 1959 of murdering a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott. Bonnie's nude body had been found in November 1958 in a wooded area a few miles from the spot on German Church Road where Barbara and Patricia Grimes had been discovered. The proximity was not lost on investigators. When police searched Melquist's apartment after his arrest in the Scott case, they found a written list of girls that included young women from the Grimes sisters' neighborhood on the south side. Investigators questioned him about Barbara and Patricia. The inquiry did not go beyond that. No charges were filed in connection with the Grimes case. Raymond Johnson, a former Chicago police officer who has spent years studying the case and maintains a blog under the name Chicago History Cop, believes Melquist was involved in the Grimes murders and has written extensively about the reasons he holds that view. He has also argued publicly that the failure to pursue Melquist more aggressively in connection with Barbara and Patricia may have been influenced by Melquist's connections to organized crime figures operating in Chicago at the time. Johnson said in an interview that he believes someone still does not want this case to be solved. The Cook County Sheriff's Office has maintained an active cold case investigation of the Grimes murders. As recently as 2018, Detective Jason Moran, speaking to CBS in Chicago, acknowledged the difficulty of what he was working against. He said that sometimes the passage of time works against you. He said it as a statement of fact rather than an excuse. The physical evidence from the original investigation, if any remains in a usable state, has been discussed over the years as a potential target for modern forensic testing. The bodies of the girls were examined in 1957 with the tools of 1957, and some of the biological material noted in the autopsy records, particularly in connection with the sexual assault finding related to Barbara, has been pointed to as a possible source of DNA if it was properly preserved across nearly 7 decades of chain of custody. Whether that material exists in a condition that could produce a result is not publicly known. What is publicly known is the outline of the case that was left when the investigation stalled. 2 girls walked out of a theater on a December night after watching Elvis Presley on screen for the 11th time. They had a little over $2 between them and a 50-cent coin in Barbara's wallet for emergencies. Somewhere between the Brighton Theatre and their front door, someone made a decision about them. 25 days later, they were found on the cold ground by a guardrail in Willow Springs without their clothes. Barbara was 15. Patricia was 12, 3 days short of turning 13. They are buried at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois. Their mother, Loretta, spent the rest of her life without an answer. The case file is still open. The person or people who encountered the Grimes sisters on the night of December 28, 1956, have never been named in any charge or conviction. Nearly 70 years later, the space between the concession line at the Brighton Theatre and the guardrail on German Church Road remains, in every meaningful legal sense, empty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 sisters left for a film in 1956 and were found 25 days later in a field outside Chicago, and no one has ever been charged. Next, a case from Toronto in 1973, where 2 17-year-old best friends spent an evening shopping, stopped at a diner for a late Coke, and were found shot dead in an industrial lot before sunrise, and where DNA eventually identified 2 killers whose names the world still does not know. Case 6. Wendy Tedford and Donna Stern. Wendy Ann Tedford had been born on May 12, 1955, which meant she would have turned 18 in 16 days. She had been thinking about it. She had a boyfriend she was deeply in love with, and she had been telling people that when she turned 18, they were going to get married. She had dropped out of school in 1971, 2 years earlier, after her father died of cancer, and had been working since then in the business office of a Towers department store. She had moved out of her mother's apartment on Shepherd Avenue West and into the Falstaff Avenue apartment of her older sister Shirley, who lived there with her 4-year-old son. The apartment was in the Downsview area of Toronto's North End. Wendy was the 3rd of 4 sisters. She liked to paint. She was happiest, people who knew her said, when she was working on an oil painting or putting together a model car. She was 17 years old, 16 days from 18, and she had plans. Donna Lee Stern had been born in 1956 and was also 17. She was the second of 4 children raised by her father Jack Stearn in the same general part of Toronto's North End. She was a grade 12 student at Downsview Secondary School, organised enough to be carrying her school books with her when she left the house on the evening of April 26, 1973. She had told her father she was going to Wendy's place, then they were going shopping, and she would stay the night. Jack Stearn saw no reason for concern. Donna had no enemies, he told police later. There was no reason, he said, for anyone to want to hurt her. The 2 girls had been friends for more than 4 years. They had met when they were both students at C.W. Jeffries Secondary School, before Wendy left, and the friendship had held through the changes in their lives since then. They were the kind of friends who made plans on a weekday evening and followed through without needing much of a reason beyond wanting to be around each other. On the evening of April 26, 1973, the plan was a shopping trip to Yorkdale Mall, a sleepover at Wendy's place on Falstaff Avenue, and a birthday present to buy for Shirley, whose 25th birthday was the following day. Donna left her home around 7 in the evening and arrived at Wendy's apartment around 7:30. Wendy's sister Shirley saw them together before they headed out, the last member of either family to see them. The 2 girls took the public transit bus to Yorkdale Shopping Centre, one of the larger enclosed malls in the Toronto area, and spent a couple of hours there. Investigators later found evidence of a receipt from a bazaar in the Yonge and College Streets area earlier in the evening, suggesting the girls had made a stop downtown before or around the same time as the Yorkdale visit. The exact sequence of their movements through the evening was a detail the investigation tried to reconstruct carefully and never fully resolved. What is documented is where they ended up. At approximately 10:45 in the evening, Wendy Tedford and Donna Stearn were seen at a diner called Sit and Eat, a 1950s-style burger restaurant on Keele Street, just north of Wilson Avenue, a short distance from the Downsview area where both of them lived. Witnesses saw them there, ordering Coca-Colas. The diner was a place the girls were known to visit. It was local and familiar, a late-night stop close to home, the kind of last errand before a sleepover that had no weight to it at the time. They were seen at the diner at around 10:45. Residents in the area, near the industrial lots off Wilson Avenue, reported hearing gunshots at approximately midnight. The gap between those 2 times is roughly an hour. On the morning of Friday, April 27, 1973, an 18-year-old student named Tony Iscaro was on his way to a basketball game at Downsview Collegiate. He was taking a shortcut through a vacant industrial lot when he saw 2 bodies lying together in a pool of blood. He did not stop to examine them closely. He went directly to a nearby factory at 949 Wilson Avenue and called the police. Officers arrived and confirmed what Iscaro had found. The 2 bodies were female and fully clothed. Their purses were still with them, containing small amounts of cash. There was no sign of robbery. There was no sign of a struggle at the scene, in the way such signs typically present. The victims were identified as Donna Stearn and Wendy Tedford. Wendy had been found face down, shot twice through the neck, with her arms at her sides. Donna was lying within a foot of her, on her back, shot once through the back of the head. The empty shells from a .38 caliber revolver were found nearby. Autopsies confirmed that both girls had been shot at close range with the same weapon. Toxicology and physical examination established that both girls had been sexually assaulted. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in the history of the Toronto Police Service's Homicide Division in that era. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They mapped the girls' final hours as precisely as the available witness accounts allowed. They traced their transit routes. They canvassed the Yorkdale area, the Yonge and College area, the Downsview neighbourhood, and the stretch of Wilson Avenue near the vacant lots where the bodies had been found. They looked at the boys who had been close to both girls. The on-again, off-again boyfriends of both Wendy and Donna were interviewed and eliminated. DNA taken from the scene did not match either of them. The gun was one of the more concrete leads the investigation produced in its early stages. Several months after the killings, a revolver was found on the side of a highway in southwestern Ontario. Forensic analysis of the bullet riflings linked the weapon to the shots that killed Wendy and Donna. The revolver had also been used in a robbery in Windsor, Ontario. The Windsor connection was followed up. It went somewhere, but not far enough. The link to Windsor and the suspicion that eventually formed around organized criminal activity became one of the defining threads of the case in the years that followed. Toronto Police Homicide Detective Sergeant Steve Smith, who worked the cold case file, said in a media interview that investigators came to believe the men responsible had ties to outlaw motorcycle gangs and that the case had a connection to Windsor. That belief was based on information gathered over years of investigation rather than a single piece of physical evidence, and it pointed toward a world of organized criminality that the two girls had no documented connection to. The most likely explanation for how they encountered the men who killed them, according to police, was the diner or the period immediately after they left it. Wendy and Donna were known to hitchhike occasionally. The stretch between the sit-and-eat and Wendy's apartment on Falstaff Avenue was not far, and on a late night in April, it would have been a short and unremarkable decision to accept a ride from someone who appeared to be heading in the right direction. What happened between that ride, if there was one, and the vacant lot off Wilson Avenue has never been established in a courtroom or in any official document released to the public. The case went cold in the years following the initial investigation. Leads came in periodically and were followed up. None of them resulted in an arrest. The file remained open and was carried by the Toronto Police Service Homicide Squad, among what Detective Sergeant Stacey Gallant, who ran the cold case unit in later years, called his constants, the cases he returned to regularly because the evidence warranted it and the families deserved it. In 2001, Toronto police resubmitted evidence from the 1973 killings to the Centre of Forensic Sciences. The technology available in 2001 was far beyond what had existed in April 1973, and the resubmission was part of a broader effort by the cold case unit to apply modern forensic tools to older cases where biological material had been preserved. The results were significant. Analysts were able to develop two distinct DNA profiles from the material recovered in connection with the sexual assaults. They were also able to develop a third profile from blood found at the scene. The profiles established that two separate male individuals had been present and had left biological material that survived more than 28 years. Two offenders, two profiles, no names. Detective Sergeant Smith described the 2001 findings in public statements as a major development in the investigation. The profiles were entered into the relevant databases and searched against known offenders. No match came back. The two men whose DNA was recovered from the vacant lot off Wilson Avenue in April 1973 had either never been convicted of an offence that required a DNA sample to be taken, or their samples were not in the system, or they were dead. The profiles sat without a match. In subsequent years, as genetic genealogy emerged as an investigative tool, the Tedford and Stern case was among those revisited by Toronto's cold case unit in light of the new possibilities. Genetic genealogy involves uploading a DNA profile to publicly accessible databases where people submit their own profiles for ancestry research purposes, and then tracing the family trees that emerge from partial matches to work backward toward the individual who left the original sample. The technique had been used to identify suspects in cases going back decades, including cases where the offender had been dead for years by the time the identification was made. Toronto police had already used the method successfully in other cold cases, including the identification of a man named Kenneth Smith, who died in 2019 and was posthumously identified as responsible for 3 cold case murders in Toronto spanning the 1980s and 1990s. Detective Sergeant Smith said in a media interview that police were in the process of conducting biographic ancestry testing on the DNA profiles from the Tedford and Stern case, describing it as a precursor to the full genetic genealogy process. The ancestry testing was designed to narrow down the root population, the geographic and ethnic background, of the 2 male profiles, which would then be used to focus the genealogy search more precisely. Whether that process has produced a result that has not been publicly announced, or whether it has reached another dead end, is not known from public reporting as of the time of writing. What is publicly known is that 2 DNA profiles from 2 men who were present when Wendy Tedford and Donna Stern were shot and left in a vacant lot in Toronto have existed in the investigative record since 2001. The 2 men themselves, whether alive or dead, have never been publicly identified. Linda Harris, Wendy's sister, contacted police on the Friday morning After the girls failed to come home, she had called Wendy's workplace first, the Towers department store, and learned that Wendy had not come in for her shift. She knew then that something was wrong. The call to police set off the investigation that consumed the rest of that year and stretched forward for decades without resolution. Wendy Tedford was 17 years old and 16 days from her 18th birthday, a birthday she had told people she was looking forward to because it was the birthday after which she was going to marry the person she loved. Donna Stearn was 17 and a grade 12 student with her school books in her bag on the night she went out to go shopping and have a sleepover at her best friend's place. They were found the next morning in a vacant lot 2 kilometers from the last diner they had stopped at, lying within a foot of each other, fully clothed, their purses beside them with the cash still inside. Jack Stearn, Donna's father, told investigators there was no reason for anyone to hurt his daughter. He said it as the statement of a father who knew his child, and he said it to police who had no answer for him then and would not have one for the rest of his life. Jack Stearn died in 2010. The case was still open when he died. It is still open now. 2 profiles exist. 2 men left evidence of themselves in a vacant lot in Toronto on the night of April 26, 1973. Their names are not in any public record. The investigation that has carried their profiles for more than 50 years is still active. Whether modern forensic genealogy will eventually produce a name, or whether the 2 men who shot Wendy Tedford and Donna Stearn will remain 2 profiles in a database without faces attached to them, is something that cannot yet be answered. What can be said is that 52 years have passed since 2 17-year-old best friends stopped at a diner for a Coke at the end of an evening of shopping and never made it home, and the people responsible for that have never stood in front of a judge. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 2 best friends, 1 evening, 1 vacant lot, and 2 DNA profiles that have sat without names attached to them for more than 50 years. Next, a 9-year-old girl in Arlington, Texas, was snatched from a parking lot in broad daylight in January 1996, and the tragedy that followed gave the world a system that has since helped save more than 1,000 children, while the man who took her has never been found. Case 7. Amber Hageman, Saturday, January 13, 1996. Was not especially cold for a winter afternoon in Arlington, Texas. The sky was clear, and the streets in the east side of the city were quiet in the way they get on weekend afternoons, when the traffic has settled and the neighborhood belongs to whoever is out in it. Amber Renee Hageman was 9 years old. She had received a pink bicycle for Christmas a few weeks earlier, and she had been riding it whenever she could since then. On that afternoon, she and her 5-year-old brother Ricky were out together, riding near the house of their grandparents, where the family was visiting. Amber's mother, Donna Williams, had told them not to go far. They stayed close, within a few blocks, the way children do when they know the boundaries and respect them. At some point, Amber pedaled a short distance to the parking lot of an abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store on East Abrams Street. The store had been closed for a while, and the lot was empty, flat and open, a good surface for riding. Ricky decided to turn back and pedaled home ahead of his sister. He did not see what happened next. A 78-year-old man named Jimmy Kevill was in his backyard, which bordered the parking lot, when he saw Amber riding her bicycle in the empty space. He watched a black pickup truck pull into the lot and stop alongside her. A man got out of the truck. He grabbed Amber off the bicycle and pulled her toward the vehicle as she screamed and kicked. She was trying to get free. She could not get free. The man forced her into the cab and drove away towards central Arlington. Jimmy Kevill went inside and called 911. He gave the dispatcher what he had seen. It was the only phone call that would turn out to matter, and Kevill was the only person who came forward to say they had witnessed the abduction. Arlington police responded immediately. Amber's pink bicycle was still lying in the parking lot where she had been taken from it. Officers fanned out across the area. The call went to the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office and to the FBI. Within hours, hundreds of tips were coming in from across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. 30 FBI agents were deployed alongside local police. The search covered East Arlington and the surrounding communities, following every account that placed a black pickup, a young girl, or anything close to Jimmy Kevill's description anywhere in the region. None of those tips led to Amber. 4 days after she was taken, on January 17, 1996, a man walking his dog near a drainage culvert behind the Forest Hill Apartments in North Arlington found a small body in the creek bed. Amber Hagerman had been found approximately 4 miles from the parking lot where she had been grabbed. She was unclothed. The medical examiner determined that she had died from severe laceration wounds to her neck and throat. The injuries indicated she had been held alive for at least 2 days after the abduction before she was killed. The body was found 4 days after she disappeared, but she had been alive for 2 of those days, somewhere, before the person who took her made a final decision. The Arlington Police Department processed the scene. Rain had fallen in the area in the period between the abduction and the discovery of the body, which complicated the collection and preservation of physical evidence. What was gathered from the scene was submitted to the relevant forensic laboratories. A description of the suspect was built from Jimmy Kevil's account. The man Kevil saw was white or Hispanic, in his 20s or 30s at the time, under 6 feet tall, with a medium build and brown or black hair. The truck he drove was a 1980s or 1990s full-size single-cab pickup with a short wheelbase, in good condition, with no visible damage, no chrome or striping, and a solid rear window without a sliding panel. That description has been issued and reissued in the nearly 30 years since Amber Hagerman was taken from the Winn-Dixie parking lot. It has never produced an arrest. Jimmy Kevil lived with what he had seen for the rest of his life. He gave interviews over the years, describing the afternoon in a backyard in East Arlington, the bicycle in the empty lot, the truck, the girl who screamed. He died in May 2016, 20 years after the abduction, without ever knowing who had been driving the truck. He was the sole witness. The description he gave is the only physical account of the man who took Amber Hagerman that exists in the public record. The community response to Amber's death was immediate and shaped by grief and frustration in equal measure. Among the people who heard the story on the news in the days after the abduction was a Dallas woman named Diana Simone, a massage therapist and mother who had been watching a home movie clip of Amber on the evening news. Seeing the little girl hold up a Barbie doll for the camera and ride her new pink bicycle, before the anchor explained who the child was and what had happened to her. Simone was not law enforcement. She had no professional connection to the case. She was a mother who had watched a home movie of a 9-year-old who had since been taken by a stranger and found dead in a creek, and she had an idea. On January 27, 1996, 2 weeks after the abduction, Simone wrote a letter to the manager of a local radio station, KDMX-FM in Dallas-Fort Worth. She made a simple argument. Weather alerts existed to warn the public when dangerous conditions were approaching. Civil defense alerts existed to warn people of emergencies. She asked why there was no equivalent system for child abductions, something that would interrupt radio programming immediately when a child was taken, give the public a description of the vehicle and the suspect, and put thousands of people behind the wheel of their own cars on alert at the same moment. Her one request, she wrote, was that whatever system emerged be called Amber's Plan. The letter was shared among radio station managers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. By October 1996, more than 25 local radio stations had joined with law enforcement to establish a coordinated emergency alert plan for child abductions. That same month, President Bill Clinton signed the Amber Hagerman Child Protection Act, which expanded federal jurisdiction over repeat child sex offenders and mandated life sentences for those convicted of a second sexual offense against a child. The broadcast alert system was named in Amber's honor, taking the letters of her name and building the acronym America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. The first alert went out in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in July 1997. The system spread. By 2003, a federal law established the Amber Alert program at the national level, coordinating it across all 50 states. The alerts moved from radio to highway signs, to hotel televisions, to internet platforms, to the wireless emergency alert system that sends a loud tone to every mobile phone in a defined geographic area simultaneously. By 2021, the 25th anniversary of Amber's abduction, more than 1,074 children had been safely recovered as a direct result of Amber Alerts in the United States alone. The system had spread to 27 other countries. The first documented success came 16 months after the first alert was issued. when a babysitter who had taken an 8-week-old infant was identified and the baby was recovered 90 minutes after the alert went out. That baby grew up and started college years later, without knowing that the system that helped bring them home was built from a letter a mother in Dallas wrote about a 9-year-old girl in a parking lot. The case itself continued. Arlington police received tips at a steady enough rate that officials described it, in internal terms, as never technically going cold, the file defined as active, on the basis that no 180-day period had passed without a new lead coming in. By the time of the 25th anniversary press conference in January 2021, investigators had processed more than 7,000 tips. None had resulted in an arrest or a charge. At that press conference, Arlington Assistant Police Chief Kevin Colby disclosed that evidence from the original investigation had been identified as a potential source of DNA material belonging to the person responsible, and that investigators were preparing to submit that evidence for enhanced forensic testing using methods that had not been available in 1996. The intent was to build a more complete genetic profile that could be run against modern databases. Whether that testing produced a usable result has not been publicly confirmed. Colby said at the same press conference that police believed someone in the community had seen something on January 13, 1996, and had not come forward, either out of fear, reluctance to be involved, or some other reason that had seemed important at the time. He said that whatever the reason had been, the department needed people to search their memories and bring forward anything that might have value. Amber's mother, Donna Williams, has spoken about her daughter at every major anniversary of the case. She has said in interviews that she misses Amber every day. She has said that Amber was full of life, and that she was only a little girl, and that she wants to know why. At the 25th anniversary press conference, she addressed the person responsible directly. She asked him to turn himself in. She said she was asking him to give Amber justice. Ricky Hageman, who was 5 years old when his sister was taken from the parking lot he had just left, has spoken to reporters over the years about what it has been like to carry that afternoon with him. He said in a 2016 interview that she was on his mind every day and that she had been like his best friend and like a second mother to him. He was 5 years old when she was pulled off her bicycle, and he rode home not knowing that anything had gone wrong, because nothing had gone wrong yet, because she was still in the lot when he left, and he could not have known what was about to happen. And that is the kind of thing that does not go away. The suspect Jimmy Kevill described was in his 20s or 30s in January 1996. That calculation places him in his 50s or 60s today, if he is still alive. He drove a black pickup truck in good condition with no visible damage. He knew the parking lot of the abandoned Winn-Dixie on East Abrams Street well enough to drive into it without hesitation, and he left it with a 9-year-old girl in the cab and drove towards central Arlington. He was somewhere for 4 days with Amber Hageman. Then he was somewhere else. He has been somewhere else ever since, and the Arlington Police Department has spent 30 years trying to find out where. The name Amber Hageman is now embedded in the infrastructure of child safety across more than 30 countries. Every time a phone buzzes with an emergency alert and a description of a missing child and a vehicle, every time someone on the highway sees the overhead sign and slows down to look, the system behind it traces back to a 9-year-old girl on a pink bicycle and a 78-year-old man in his backyard who saw what happened and knew enough to call. What it does not trace back to is a conviction. The person who drove away from that parking lot on January 13, 1996, has never been found. Amber Hageman's case is in the same folder it has been in since the day she was taken. Still active, still open, 30 years deep, still waiting. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A 9-year-old girl's abduction built the system that has since helped save more than 1,000 children. The man who took her has never been identified. Next, a case from Austin, Texas in 1991, where 4 teenage girls working the closing shift at a yogurt shop were bound, shot, and left inside a building that was then set on fire, and where the search for justice lasted more than 3 decades before arriving at an answer that no living person will ever be made to answer for. Case 8. The Yogurt Shop 4. The I Can't Believe It's Yogurt Shop on West Anderson Lane in Austin, Texas, was the kind of place that fit naturally into the rhythm of a busy Friday night. It sat in a strip mall in a commercial stretch of North Austin, cheerful and brightly lit. the kind of establishment where teenagers worked weekend shifts and customers came in late after the movies or dinner. On the evening of December 6, 1991, 4 girls were working the closing shift. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old. Her younger sister Sarah was 15. Eliza Thomas was also 17. Amy Ayres was 13 years old and had come to keep her friends company while they finished their work. None of them had done anything to attract what happened to them. They were just there. Firefighters responded to a blaze at the strip mall in the early hours of December 7, 1991. When they entered the yogurt shop and brought the fire under control, they found 4 bodies inside. All 4 girls had been bound with their own clothing, their hands tied and their mouths gagged. All 4 had been shot in the head. Amy Ayres had been shot twice. At least one of the girls had been sexually assaulted. The fire had been set deliberately, investigators concluded, in an apparent attempt to destroy the physical evidence of what had been done inside the building before the flames were discovered. The smoke and soot covered every surface in the shop, making fingerprinting nearly impossible. The first investigator on the scene, John Jones, said later that you could not touch anything in there without getting covered in it. Austin had not seen anything like it. The city was shaken in a way that a community gets shaken when violence arrives in a place that felt safe and ordinary and claims 4 people who had nothing to do with anything dark. Jennifer and Sarah Harbison were sisters. They had gone to work together. Amy Ayres, at 13, was the youngest and had not been scheduled to be there at all. She was there because that is what you do when your friends are at work, and you want to be around them. Eliza Thomas was finishing the shift alongside people she knew. The building was locked and dark by the time anyone realized something had gone wrong, and by then whatever had happened inside was already over. The investigation that followed became one of the most watched, and eventually one of the most complicated in Texas law enforcement history. Thousands of tips came in from across the Austin area. Dozens of people confessed to the crime over the years that followed, most of them assessed quickly as false. The physical evidence was limited by the fire and by the water used to extinguish it. Investigators worked the case hard through the 1990s without making an arrest. In late 1999, 8 years after the killings, 4 young men were arrested and charged. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Welborn, and Maurice Pierce had all been teenagers at the time of the crime, connected to each other and to the area around the strip mall. The investigation had built toward them through a combination of witness accounts and interrogation sessions, in which 3 of the 4 eventually gave statements that investigators treated as confessions. The men insisted from the beginning that the confessions had been coerced, that the interrogations had been conducted using pressure and manipulation that produced statements their attorneys argued were false. A grand jury declined to indict Welborn. Prosecutors dropped the charges against Pierce. Robert Springsteen went to trial first and was convicted in 2001. He was sentenced to death. Michael Scott was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to life in prison. For the families of the 4 girls, the convictions brought something that felt like resolution after a decade of waiting. For Springsteen and Scott and their families, they brought the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. Both convictions were overturned in the years that followed. The appeals process identified problems with the interrogation methods, with the absence of physical evidence connecting either man to the crime, and with the coercive conditions under which the confessions had been obtained. In 2009, a judge ordered the charges against both Springsteen and Scott dismissed entirely. The order came after new DNA testing, using methods that had not been available in 1991 or at the time of the original trials, revealed the presence of an unidentified male at the crime scene. The DNA did not match Springsteen, Scott, Welborn, or Pierce. It did not match anyone in the relevant databases. It pointed to someone the investigation had not yet found. Maurice Pierce, who had spent 3 years in jail without ever being convicted, was released. He died in 2010 after a confrontation with police during a traffic stop. Forrest Welborn, who had never been charged after the grand jury declined to indict, had spent years living under the cloud of public suspicion that comes with being named in connection with a crime of this nature. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, having served years in prison for something a court had ultimately determined they could not be proven to have done, returned to lives that the convictions had permanently altered. All 4 had lost years. All four had lost relationships. All four had lost the version of their adult lives that would have existed without the accusations. The families of Jennifer, Sarah, Eliza, and Amy waited again. The DNA pointed somewhere, but not at anyone with a name. The file remained open. Cold case detectives carried it through the 2000s and 2010s, alongside everything else the Austin Police Department had accumulated over the years. In 2018, something shifted. Missouri authorities, working a separate set of cases, determined through DNA analysis that a man named Robert Eugene Brashes was responsible for the strangulation of a woman in South Carolina in 1990 and the shooting of a mother and daughter in Missouri in 1998. Brashes had also been connected by DNA to the rape of a 14-year-old girl in Tennessee in 1997. Brashes himself had been dead since January 1999, when he shot himself during an hours-long standoff with police at a motel in Kennett, Missouri. He was 40 years old when he died. He had been born on March 13, 1958, and had left behind a trail of violence across multiple states that investigators were still mapping years after his death. The connection to the yogurt shop murders did not come until 2025. Austin cold case detective Daniel Jackson had been working the case for years. In June 2025, he resubmitted ballistics evidence from the crime scene, specifically a spent shell casing from a .38 caliber handgun found in a floor drain inside the shop, to the National Integrated Ballistic Information Network. The network is a database maintained to link firearms to crime scenes across jurisdictions. The resubmission produced a match. The ballistics connected the shell casing from the Austin yogurt shop to an unsolved murder in Kentucky. The weapon type used in both cases was consistent with the make and model of the pistol Brashes had used to shoot himself in the Missouri standoff in 1999. In August 2025, Detective Jackson received a report from a laboratory in South Carolina. The lab had been running the yogurt shop's unidentified DNA profile against its own database. The report identified a complete YSTR match. The profile from the yogurt shop matched the known YSTR profile from the 1990 South Carolina case that had already been attributed to Robert Eugene Brashes. A Y-star profile traces the male line of a family and is passed directly from father to son. The match meant the same male line that had committed the South Carolina offense in 1990 had also left biological material inside the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, in December 1991. To confirm the identification beyond that, investigators obtained DNA from Amy Ayres's fingernail clippings, material that had been preserved from the original investigation 34 years earlier. The testing produced a result that carried a 2.5 million to 1 likelihood that the genetic material under Amy Ayres's fingernails belonged to Robert Eugene Brashes. In her final moments, investigators concluded Amy Ayres had fought back against the person who was doing what was being done to her, and in fighting back, she had preserved the evidence that would eventually answer the question her family had been asking since December 7, 1991. Detective Jackson said at the press conference that Amy's final moments on Earth were to solve the case. He said it because that is what the evidence showed had happened. On September 26, 2025, Austin Police Chief Lisa Davis stood at a news conference and named Robert Eugene Brashes as the suspect in the yogurt shop murders. She said that after 34 years, the department had made a significant breakthrough. She said it was one of the most devastating and haunting cases in the city's history. Austin Mayor Kirk Watson said the day had been a long time coming. Members of the families of the 4 girls sat in the room and listened to the names of their daughters and sisters, spoken alongside the name of the man investigators were now certain had taken them. Brashes had been dead for 26 years by that point. He could not be arrested. He could not be charged. He could not be tried. He could not be convicted. There was no courtroom that could produce a verdict in the case of the 4 girls in the yogurt shop, because the man who killed them had shot himself in a Missouri motel room in January 1999, 8 years after the night on West Anderson Lane, and the law has no mechanism for holding a dead man accountable. On February 19, 2026, State District Judge Dana Blasey convened a hearing in a packed Austin courtroom and formally declared Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Forrest Wellborn, and Maurice Pierce's estate innocent of the yogurt shop murders. She said the words directly, "You are innocent." She called the order an obligation to the rule of law and an obligation to the dignity of the individual. Prosecutors stood before the court and apologized. Scott and Wellborn sat in the courtroom and heard the judge say it. Springsteen did not attend. The family of Maurice Pierce, who had died in 2010, was represented by people who had known him. In May 2026, the city of Austin reached a settlement with the men and the estate of Maurice Pierce. The settlement totaled $35 million to be divided among the four. It had not yet been formally approved by the city council at the time of the most recent reporting, but the terms had been agreed. $35 million distributed among four people who had spent years in prison or in jail or under the open suspicion of having committed one of the worst crimes in Austin's history for something a dead serial killer had done the night of December 6, 1991. Jennifer Harbison was 17. Sarah Harbison was 15. Eliza Thomas was 17. Amy Ayers was 13 and had not even been scheduled to work that night. She had come to be with her friends at the end of their shift. She had scratched and fought in the last moments of her life, and what she put under her fingernails in those moments sat in a laboratory sample for 34 years before the technology existed to read it clearly enough to attach a name to it. The name it eventually produced was the name of a man who had already been dead for more than 2 decades. The case is as closed as it is ever going to get. There is no trial, there is no sentencing, there is no moment of confrontation between the survivors and the person responsible. There is a dead man named Robert Eugene Brashers, identified by DNA 34 years after the fact, and 4 families who waited the entire span of time between 1991 and 2025 for the answer to a question that arrived too late to do anything with. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 4 girls in a yogurt shop, a dead suspect, and 34 years between the crime and the answer. The final case in this video stays in England in 1996, where a 25-year-old hospital worker vanished after a nightclub in Bath. Her remains found 13 years later wrapped in bin bags beside a motorway, and where 11 arrests and decades of investigation have still not produced a single charge. Case 9. Melanie Hall. The evening of Saturday, June 8, 1996, was not a night anyone in Bath was likely to forget easily, though for most people who were out in the city that night, the reason had nothing to do with Melanie Hall. England were playing Switzerland in the opening match of the Euro '96 football championships, and Alan Shearer had scored. Bath city centre was alive in the way it gets when a major tournament opens on a Saturday evening in summer, the pubs full from early afternoon, and the streets busy well into the small hours. Cadillac's nightclub on Walcott Street was one of the venues that drew the late crowd. It was the kind of place the city had several of in the mid-90s, a basement room with a dance floor and a bar, and the particular atmosphere of a night that felt like it was just beginning even at midnight. The timing matters because it means Bath that night was unusually full, unusually loud, unusually impossible to see through. Whatever happened to Melanie Hall happened in the middle of one of the busiest evenings the city had seen all year. Melanie Hall had been born on August 20th, 1970. She was 25 years old in June 1996, a year out of the University of Bath, where she had completed a degree in psychology and sociology in 1995. She had taken a job as a clerical officer at the Royal United Hospital in Bath, after graduating, working in the administrative side of the hospital while she settled into life after university. By the summer of 1996, she had been in the job for roughly a year. She had a boyfriend named Philip Karlbaum, and a group of friends and the kind of ordinary, forward-moving adult life that a 25-year-old who had finished her degree and started a career might reasonably expect to be building. She was from Wiltshire, and her family were nearby. She was not difficult to locate in the geography of her own life. She had structure and people and a routine, and on the evening of June 8, her plans were entirely unremarkable. Melanie's mother dropped her off at Philip's home that evening. She and Philip went out together with another couple to Cadillac's nightclub in Walcott Street, a short walk through the older part of Bath near the Roman Baths and the Abbey. The evening started well enough. At some point during the night, Philip saw Melanie dancing with another man. An argument followed between them, the kind that happens between couples in nightclubs when one of them feels something they did not expect to feel. Philip left the club and went home alone. It was the kind of falling out that usually gets resolved the next morning over tea, the kind that both people have mostly forgotten within a week. Philip went home. Melanie stayed. The last confirmed sighting of Melanie Hall alive was at 1:10 in the morning of Sunday, June 9th, 1996. Her friends had just left the club. She was sitting on a bar stool beside the dance floor on her own. That single moment, a woman of 25 alone in a nightclub, in the early hours of a Sunday morning, in a city full of noise and people, and no particular reason to be frightened, is the last image the investigation has ever been able to verify. After that, nothing confirmed. After that, a gap that stretched for 13 years and has never been filled. The details of what she was wearing that evening have been part of every public appeal in the 30 years since. A pale blue silk dress with a round neck, black suede mule shoes with straps across the front, and an open toe, size 5 or 6. A cream single-breasted long-sleeve jacket, a black satchel-type handbag, a next watch with an expanding bracelet, silver drop earrings, a Midland Bank checkbook and check guarantee card in the handbag. None of those items have ever been found. The level of detail in the description is the kind that builds up over years of appeals, each one adding a small piece to the picture in the hope that something will connect in someone's memory. After 30 years of those appeals, the description is very complete. The woman it belongs to has never been located. A missing person inquiry was launched the following day, June 10th, 1996. The nightclub was canvassed. Philip was interviewed. Friends and acquaintances were spoken to. Witness accounts from Cadillacs were gathered and cross-referenced. The investigation covered the streets around Walcott Street and the routes a person might take leaving the club in the early hours of a Sunday morning in June. Nothing produced a confirmed sighting of Melanie after 1:10. No one came forward who had seen her leave the building, or seen her outside it afterward, or seen her get into a car, or walk in any direction. She was there on the bar stool at 1:10, and after that she was not anywhere that anyone could account for. The case drew significant resources over the years that followed. Avon and Somerset police conducted interviews across Bath and the surrounding area. DNA samples were taken from hundreds of men who had been in the area on the night of her disappearance, or who came into the investigation for other reasons. Officers followed up tips that came in from the public through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. The file grew over years into something that Detective Chief Inspector Ben Lavender, who leads the current cold case team, has described as one of the longest-running and highest-profile investigations Avon and Somerset police have ever conducted, involving hundreds of officers across nearly 3 decades. In March 2003, 7 years after Melanie disappeared, police searching several sites in the Bath area arrested 2 men on suspicion of her murder. Both were released without charge months later. The investigation continued. Tips came in periodically. Television appeals were made. The case became a constant feature of the Avon and Somerset Cold Case Unit, returned to regularly and never set aside. On October 5, 2009, 13 years and nearly 4 months after Melanie Hall was last seen at Cadillacs, a workman clearing vegetation beside the northbound slipway at junction 14 of the M5 motorway near Thornbury in South Gloucestershire found a large black bin liner in the scrubland. Inside the bag were a human skull, a pelvis, and a thigh bone. The remains were taken for forensic examination. They were confirmed to be Melanie Hall's. Searches of the surrounding undergrowth over the following days recovered additional scattered bones. Among the items found with the remains was a distinctive gold ring that Melanie's grandmother had given her, along with a bracelet and earrings. The identification was confirmed beyond doubt. The forensic examination of the remains found that Melanie had suffered severe fractures to her skull and face, injuries consistent with significant blunt force trauma to the head inflicted before her death. A definitive cause of death could not be established because of the advanced state of decomposition after 13 years outdoors, but the fractures made clear that what had happened to her had been violent. She had been wrapped in black bin liners and tied with blue polypropylene rope before being left beside the motorway slipway. Her clothing, her handbag, her checkbook and card, her watch and earrings were not found with the remains and have never been found. The location where her remains were discovered sits approximately 28 miles north of Bath, beside the M5 between Bristol and the Severn Estuary. Junction 14 connects to the Thornbury area. The slipway is a piece of road that most people who have driven it would not be able to describe in any detail. Someone put Melanie Hall's remains there, wrapped and tied, and left them for 13 years. The choice of location was either specific and deliberate, meaning the person knew that stretch of road and had a reason for choosing it, or it was opportunistic, meaning they needed somewhere quiet and out of the way, and drove until they found something that seemed safe enough. Either way, they were right about the safety of it. The bin bags stayed where they were placed for 13 years without being disturbed, until a man with shears cleared some scrubland on a Tuesday afternoon and found them. The discovery in 2009 reopened the investigation with renewed momentum. In November 2013, a 44-year-old man was arrested at his home in Bath on suspicion of Melanie's murder. Police simultaneously searched a property in Round Hill Park in the Whiteway area of Bath, where the man had previously lived. He was bailed while the case was submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service for a charging decision. In December 2014, the CPS announced there was insufficient evidence to charge him. The decision was made by Nicola Hayward, the South West's Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor, who said she had carefully reviewed the file in line with the Code for Crown Prosecutors and concluded the evidence threshold had not been met. The man was not publicly named. He was released. The investigation continued. In the years that followed, police seized a white Volkswagen Golf GTI after receiving what they described as significant information about the case, and subsequently appealed for information about a second car of the same color, make, and model. In 2016, on the 20th anniversary of Melanie's disappearance, Detective Superintendent Andy Bevan told the public that forensic work using new techniques had produced a DNA profile from an item found near where the remains had been discovered. He said it brought investigators an important step closer to finding her killer. The DNA was run against the relevant databases. No match came back. By the early 2020s, the Avon and Somerset Cold Case Unit had begun a comprehensive review of the physical archive, digitizing 90 crates of evidence gathered across 3 decades of investigation. The material was being analyzed using modern tools, including artificial intelligence-assisted review of documents, emails, CCTV footage, and witness statements. Detective Chief Inspector Lavender said the pool of persons of interest had been reduced from under 100 to fewer than 20 through this process, and that officers were conducting fresh interviews with alibi witnesses who had been spoken to years earlier. The working assumption of the current team is that the answers exist somewhere inside the material already gathered, and that new technology offers the means of finding what earlier examinations missed. 11 people have been arrested in connection with the case across the entire span of the investigation. No one has ever been charged. In June 2026, on the 30th anniversary of Melanie's disappearance, Avon and Somerset Police launched a campaign they called Justice for Melanie. The campaign was explicitly designed to take people back to the evening of June 8, 1996, using the specifics of that night as memory anchors. England versus Switzerland. Alan Shearer's goal. Bath city centre, full of people who had reason to be out and reason to remember the night. The campaign ran advertising on digital screens at Bath Rugby Stadium during a match between Bath and Leicester Tigers on June 6, 2026. It ran in regional media and on social platforms. A reward of up to £20,000 was offered by the independent charity Crime Stoppers for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the person or people responsible. Detective Chief Inspector Lavender said in the campaign materials that the murder of Melanie Hall is one of the longest-running and highest-profile investigations Avon and Somerset Police have ever carried out. He said that just a minute of someone's time, taking them back to a normal Saturday night out in Bath 30 years ago, could prove to be a huge breakthrough. He said that one small detail or memory could solve it. After 30 years of appeals saying something very similar, the department clearly still believes that the answer exists somewhere in someone's recollection of that night, and that the person who has it has not yet understood that they have it, or has not yet decided to share it. Melanie Hall's father Steve and her sister Dominique appeared in a BBC Crime Watch appeal in March 2026, alongside Detective Chief Inspector Lavender. Her mother Pat, in an interview given after the remains were found in 2009, said she wanted to know who it was and why her daughter had been left in such a ridiculous place by the side of a motorway. She said it with the particular quality of a question that has been waiting 17 years to be asked, and the answer is still not there. The pale blue silk dress has never been found. The black suede mule shoes have never been found. The gold ring her grandmother gave her was in the bin bag beside the motorway. The last confirmed image of her is a bar stool beside the dance floor at 1:10 in the morning, and the next confirmed fact is a workman with shears in October 2009 finding something in scrubland that had been waiting there since a night in June 1996, when Bath was full and England had just drawn 1-1 with Switzerland, and no one who was out that evening had any particular reason to think they were witnessing the last night of anyone's life. Melanie Hall was 25 years old. She had her degree, she had her hospital job, she had her family in Wiltshire, and her boyfriend, and her friends, and her grandmother's ring. She sat on a bar stool at 1:10 in the morning at a nightclub in Bath, and 30 years later, the space between that bar stool and the motorway slipway in Gloucestershire is still, in every meaningful sense, empty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A woman sat alone on a bar stool at 1:10 in the morning in a nightclub in Bath and was not seen again for 13 years, and 30 years on no one has been charged with what happened to her. The final case goes back 18 years earlier to a country lane in Devon in August 1978, where a 13-year-old girl set out on her paper round on a summer morning and vanished from a road where her bicycle and scattered newspapers were found, but where she was not. Case 10. Jeanette Tate. The village of Aylesbury sits in a fold of East Devon countryside, roughly 8 miles northeast of Exeter, a small and quiet place of thatched houses and farmland, and lanes that run between high hedgerows in a way that makes it easy to disappear from the view of anyone not directly beside you. In August 1978, it was the kind of village where a 13-year-old girl could deliver newspapers along a country route on a Saturday morning without her parents giving it a second thought. Children moved through those lanes freely. The roads were known, the people were known. The danger, if there was going to be any, was supposed to come from somewhere else entirely. Jeanette Louise Tate had been born on May 5, 1965. She was 13 years old in the summer of 1978, a girl described by the people who knew her as cheerful, sociable, and ordinary in the best sense of the word. She lived in Aylesbury with her family and attended school in the area. She had a paper round that she carried out on Saturday mornings, cycling the rural lanes around the village to deliver newspapers to the households on her route. It was a job she had done before, on a route she knew, in a place where she was known. On the morning of Saturday, August 19, 1978, she set out to do it again. She left home on her bicycle somewhere around mid-morning. Her route took her along a country lane near the village. At some point that morning, 2 friends who also lived in the area and who were out walking came across something on the lane that stopped them. The bicycle was there, lying in the road. Newspapers were scattered around it, blown into the hedgerow and lying on the verge. The undelivered papers from the rest of the route spread across the lane, as if they had simply fallen from whatever was carrying them and been left where they fell. There was no sign of Jeanette. The alarm was raised and police were called. A search of the area began. Officers and volunteers went through the fields and lanes around Aylesbury across that Saturday afternoon and through the days that followed. The search expanded as the days without a result accumulated. It was one of the largest searches conducted in Devon in that period, drawing volunteers from across the county who walked the farmland and the hedgerows and the woodland around the village in the hope of finding something the initial sweep had missed. They found nothing. Jeanette Tate was not in the fields or the lanes or anywhere in the area around her paper round. She was not anywhere that could be searched. She had simply gone from the lane between one house and the next on her route, and the bicycle and the scattered papers were the only evidence that she had ever been there at all. The investigation was led by Devon and Cornwall police. In 1978, without the forensic capabilities or the national databases that would develop over the following decades, the tools available to investigators were primarily witness canvassing, physical search, and the analysis of whatever physical evidence could be gathered from the scene. The lane where the bicycle was found was examined closely. What it yielded was limited. There were no witnesses who could place a vehicle or a stranger in that exact location at the relevant time. The papers on the verge, the bicycle on the road, and the absence of the girl who had been delivering them were all that the scene contained. Hundreds of men in the area were interviewed over the weeks and months that followed. Jeanette's family, her father John Tate and her mother Sheila Cook, who had separated, both spoke publicly about their daughter and appealed for information. The case received national coverage in the press. Tips came in from across the country. The investigation ran for years without producing an arrest. The file remained open. Jeanette's body was never found. The case is officially described by Devon and Cornwall police as a murder investigation, because the circumstances of her disappearance from the lane that morning left no credible alternative explanation. But the absence of a body meant there was never physical confirmation of the fact of her death, and the absence of a suspect meant there was never a name to attach to whatever had happened on that lane. The case entered a new phase in 1994, when a man named Robert Black was convicted at Newcastle Crown Court of the abduction and murder of 3 young girls. Susan Maxwell, 11, taken from near the Scottish border in 1982, Caroline Hogg, 5, taken from a fairground in Portobello, Scotland in 1983, and Sarah Harper, 10, taken from Morley in West Yorkshire in 1986. Black was also convicted of the attempted abduction of a 4th girl and had previously been convicted of the kidnapping and sexual assault of a 5th. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 35 years. He was described by the judge and by senior law enforcement figures as one of the most dangerous men in British criminal history. Robert Black had been born in Grangemouth, Scotland in 1947. He had a documented history of sexual offending against children going back to his teenage years. By the time of his convictions in 1994, investigators working the cases of his known victims had built a picture of how he operated. He worked as a long-distance delivery driver for a poster distribution company based in London, and his job took him the length and breadth of the United Kingdom in a panel van, regularly driving routes that covered the major roads of England and Scotland. He drove alone. He stopped in towns and villages along the route. He had access to motorways and to the kind of rural areas that people assume are safe because they are quiet. His method was consistent across the cases investigators confirmed. A vehicle, a child alone, speed, and the use of the van itself as a mobile place of concealment. The children he took were not seen again until their bodies were found. One of them, Jennifer Cardy, a 9-year-old from Ballinderry in Northern Ireland, was taken in 1981, and Black was convicted of her murder in 2011, 20 years after her body was found in a reservoir in County Down. When Devon and Cornwall police reviewed the details of their own unsolved case against the emerging picture of Robert Black's crimes, the parallels were difficult to ignore. Jeanette Tate had been taken from a rural lane in broad daylight during a period when Black's driving routes regularly brought him through the southwest of England. The area around Exeter was part of a delivery network his employer serviced. In 1996, an eyewitness came forward who claimed to have seen a vehicle matching the model Black was known to have driven in 1978 at Exeter Airport on the day of Jeanette's disappearance. Exeter Airport sits approximately 12 miles from Aylesbury. The sighting was investigated but could not be confirmed to the standard required to support a charge. The investigation could not establish definitively that Black had been in Aylesbury on the morning of August 19, 1978. The case against Robert Black in connection with Jeanette Tate was built slowly and carefully across the years following his 1994 conviction. Investigators used a scoring system that assessed each suspect against key criteria associated with Black's confirmed crimes, working through a list of more than 300 suspects who had been identified over the life of the investigation and eliminating each of them against the criteria. By the time the process was complete, Black was the only person remaining who could not be eliminated. Among the most significant pieces of information gathered during this period was an account of Black having spoken to a member of prison staff in a way that amounted to an admission that he had visited Aylesbury. The admission was not a full confession. It was the kind of statement that falls short of a formal acknowledgement, but that investigators treat as meaningful because it places the speaker in a location they had no documented reason to be. The investigation was formally reopened in 2014, driven in part by the Court of Appeal's decision in 2013 to uphold Black's 2011 conviction for the murder of Jennifer Cardy. which reinforced the legal framework for prosecuting him for crimes committed decades earlier. Devon and Cornwall police assembled a team that included experienced retired officers who came back specifically to work the Jeanette Tate file. The team worked with the existing archive and with the new information gathered through the years of cold case review. By early 2016, they had prepared a 500-page dossier identifying Robert Black as the person responsible for Jeanette's abduction and murder. The file was being prepared for submission to the Crown Prosecution Service, and early indications from the CPS were that a charge was probable. Robert Black died on January 12, 2016, at Magaberry High Security Prison in Northern Ireland, from natural causes. He was 68 years old. He was serving 12 life sentences at the time of his death. He had been in custody since 1990, when a police officer in the village of Stow in the Scottish borders stopped a van and found a 6-year-old girl inside it, gagged and bound and stuffed inside a sleeping bag. That moment ended his freedom and his ability to continue what he had been doing across Britain for more than 2 decades. It did not end anything for the families of the children whose cases he never acknowledged. Devon and Cornwall police had been 5 weeks from submitting the file to the CPS when Black died. Detective Superintendent Paul Bergen said afterward that early indications from the Crown Prosecution Service were that it was probable they would have charged Black with Jeanette's murder. He said they had been very close to a decision. He said Black's death had been totally unexpected. The file was submitted to the CPS in April 2016, as planned. The CPS reviewed it and announced that, due to Black's death, there would be no posthumous decision to charge him. The law in England and Wales does not permit a criminal charge to be brought against a person who is dead. The 500-page dossier naming Robert Black as Jeanette Tate's killer was filed, and the formal investigation effectively ended. John Tate, Jeanette's father, was briefed by police on the contents of the dossier after its submission. He was 74 years old at the time and was battling cancer. He told a reporter from the Scottish Daily Mail that, having read the police report, he was now convinced that Robert Black had been the person responsible for his daughter's disappearance. He said the report contained significant new information gathered over years of painstaking work, including the jail admission and the Exeter airport sighting. He said the reason police had not been able to charge Black earlier was that they had needed to rule out more than 300 other suspects, and that doing so had taken the years it had taken. He said it with the measured tone of a man who had spent 38 years without an answer, and had finally received one, in a form that arrived too late to produce any consequence. Jeanette Tate's body has never been found. She was 13 years old on the morning of August 19, 1978, when she cycled out along the lanes of Aylesbury with a bag of newspapers and did not come back. Her bicycle was found in the road. The papers were scattered in the hedgerow. What happened between the last moment she was on that bicycle and the moment someone found it lying in the lane without her is something Robert Black took with him when he died in Magaberry Prison on a January morning in 2016. He told investigators nothing. He made no confession. The only indication that he was ever in Aylesbury came from the informal admission to the prison staff member, and that admission was not enough to produce a charge while he was alive, and no charge can be brought against a dead man. The case is listed by Devon and Cornwall police as an open murder investigation. The CPS's decision not to make a posthumous charging determination means the official record carries no named perpetrator, no verdict, and no closure. Jeanette Tate was born on May 5, 1965. She would have been 61 years old this year. Her father John died without seeing a conviction. Her mother Sheila lived with the same absence. The newspapers from her last delivery round were found in a hedgerow in East Devon, and nothing that came after that, across 48 years of investigation, managed to fully close the distance between the lane in Aylesbury and anything that would count, in a court of law, as justice. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.